Tibet. A land of monasteries, monks, and faith. With a leader, the Dalai Lama, exiled from his homeland. Journalists are unwelcome here. Foreign visitors are discouraged. On the roof of the world, much is as it has always been. Much has changed forever. 60 years ago, the Chinese marched into Tibet. The Tibetans have never accepted this occupation. It's a conflict that concerns the whole world. The Potala Palace in Tibet's capital, Lhasa. The young Dalai Lama lived here as a child, preparing himself to take up the reins of power. Until he was forced to flee 50 years ago. Yet he's still close to the faithful. Every day they pray for his return, if not in this life, then in the next. They turn their prayer wheels with this desire, the wheels containing their sacred Buddhist texts. All Tibetans live in hope of reincarnation, for they cannot expect much from this life. And the Chinese, above all, are responsible for that. They invaded Tibet 60 years ago. They said they had peacefully liberated the country from suppression by the monks. But for most Tibetans, the arrival of the Chinese was the start of their suffering. Hundreds of thousands died, tortured, starved to death, or simply murdered. For the Chinese, this is unfortunate ancient history. Today, they're proud that Lhasa has come to look like any other Chinese city. They've brought progress. But here as elsewhere, the Chinese have taken the good jobs. They have the better education, and they dominate commerce, even down to the smallest businesses.
Now most bigger town, the Tibetan already become minority. On the roadside, the shopkeepers, restaurant, many, most of them, like in Lhasa or bigger town, are all owned by Chinese.
Sometimes Tibetans' frustrations burst out in violence. These ugly images hardly fit our picture of Tibet, the land of peace. But here the Chinese regulate not just business, but thought too. Even speaking about the Dalai Lama can mean a prison sentence. The Chinese react with extreme brutality when anyone questions their policies in any way. And yet most Tibetans don't want independence. They want cultural freedom, and they want a greater say in decisions about their future. We journey far and wide through a country half as big as Western Europe. 2,000 kilometers from the Indian border, past the holy mountain of Kailash to the capital, Lhasa, to find out how the Tibetans and the Chinese live here today. We visit monasteries, nomads, and Chinese new towns. Four official escorts observe our every movement, so that only the official truth is reported about Tibet. But other truths are impossible to ignore. The monastery of Toling in the far west of the country. The school of Buddhism that chose the Dalai Lama as its head was founded here. The Chinese almost entirely destroyed Tolin in the 1960s. Up to 300 monks lived here before the Chinese banished them. Today, there are 10. We're not allowed to ask the monks questions about the Dalai Lama, and our Chinese minders have explicitly forbidden the abbot, Phun Shok, to talk about him.
Tuling
Monastery is the most important, the most precious monastery in all Tibet. It's more than 1,000 years old. Only the Potala in Lhasa has such a long history.
Since the Chinese takeover of Tibet, tens of thousands of monks have been murdered in this country. And more than 6,000 monasteries have been destroyed.
And not only is it the destruction of the monastery, but through generations some collected sort of things also is lost. And then I think the worst thing is the 1,000-year-old very, very rare scriptures wrote on palm leaf, most of them completely disappear.
Toling's sacred portraits of Buddha have been desecrated. During the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s, many statues were destroyed here too. The monks who have returned have just begun to rebuild their monastery with the help of donations and volunteers from Switzerland. The local authorities tolerate the restoration, but are paying nothing. Inside the ruins of the monastery, fragments of statues are scattered all around. The destruction of this place is one of the most terrible chapters of Tibetan history. Who knows what Abbot Phun Shok would tell us about it if he were allowed to speak. He could certainly tell us how the Chinese control the monastery today. They've built a small town right next door. Almost all the inhabitants are soldiers, some in uniform, some in civilian clothes. As to what they're doing here, the activities of the Chinese army in Tibet are a state secret.
Can you tell me what your work is here?
Rather not.
How long are you going to stay in Tibet?
I'm going to wait and see. If everything goes well, I'll stay for a long time. If not, I'll see what I can do.
How do you like life here?
Not as much as life in the motherland, in China. But you have to make a living.
China will always need to keep soldiers here in western Tibet, to enforce Chinese rule, and to stop Tibetans fleeing to India. The frontier is just 30 kilometers away. The army also makes sure the Chinese can exploit the region's mineral riches. The mountains of Tibet contain gold, silver, and the world's biggest reserves of lithium. The mines are right here, but we're not allowed to visit them. Tibetans are not interested in minerals when they come here. For them, this is the center of the world, and this mountain is its holiest place. Every Tibetan wants to walk around Mount Kailash at least once in his life, all 52 kilometers. A prone pilgrimage like this is especially valuable for reincarnation. These pilgrims will need more than a month to complete their spiritual cleansing. It took these pilgrims 7 days to get here from their village on foot. Tibetans need permission from the Chinese government even to visit their holy mountains. And if you haven't got permission, you'd better keep out of the way of the authorities. So they've been avoiding the Chinese checkpoints.
We walk around the mountain so that we can earn merits and we can be freed of our sins. At the same time, we murmur our prayer wishes so that things will be better for us in the next life.
If they seem relaxed, it's because they believe their profound faith will outlive the communism imposed on them by the Chinese. What are 60 years of foreign domination compared to eternity? When in the wheel of life, everything comes and everything goes again. If you walk around the mountain once, the sins of one future life are cleansed. Walking round 3 times cleanses the sins of 3 lives, and if you walk round 13 times, you will live free of sin for 13 lives. This is the belief of Tibetans today, as it was before the Chinese came. For even 70 years ago, Tibet was not a free country, but a dictatorship of monks and nobles who were banding together to oppose reforms. In order to maintain the purity of Buddhist teachings, they cut off the country from the rest of the world. The people were unhappy, all the more because their temporal and spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, had died, and his successor had not yet been found. A search commission had been sent out to find a new Dalai Lama. Secret signs pointed north to the province of Amdo. But the commission had been searching for 6 years without success. Until they visited Lamo Tondup, the 5th son of a simple farmer. The ambassadors had brought certain objects with them. Some were new, and some had belonged to the old Dalai Lama. Only if the child selected the old objects might he be the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama. Lamo Tondup chose the right ones. He was the new God King. As the 14th Dalai Lama, he was taken to Lhasa.
Then long journey, about I think 2 months journey, 2 months or 1.5 months, something like that is a long journey. And of course, a few occasions, I remember in early morning, I sit on a small throne, and directly one member of the search party, and his eyes are quite round, and something pierced towards me. That I remember quite clearly. Not like that.
The Dalai Lama's journey took him through a huge undeveloped region, the home of the nomads. As they have done for centuries, they still drive their herds over mountains and through valleys in search of new pastures. Even the Chinese haven't really succeeded in bringing them under their control. We're invited into the tent of the Belchu family to take chung, home-brewed barley beer. The nomads use dried yak dung as fuel for cooking and heating, as they always have done. But one thing has changed. This tent is only their second home.
In summer we live in the tent, and in winter we have a house. When we move, we take everything with us.
He tells us that it gets very cold in winter here. It's much better to be in a house. And the nomads have the Chinese to thank that there are houses for them. The Belchu family own 20 yaks and more than 200 Kashmir goats. But just one of their 5 children goes to school. The head of the family explained to us. When the Chinese authorities sent officials to take the children away to school, we told them one was hard of hearing, another couldn't see well, and two were too young. And after that, we had no choice. We had to send the last one to a boarding school. The family need all the help they can get with the animals. Tomorrow is market day in the nearest village. They'll be selling some of their goats. There will only be a few people there who can remember that 70 years ago, a young god king traveled through the country. The route to the holy city of Lhasa. The arrival of the young Dalai Lama heralded a new age. People paid homage to him wherever his procession passed. They hoped he would end the corrupt regime of the monks and would introduce reforms.
And at that time, the people, as they very, very keen to see me, and I myself also. You see, they usually, you see, those what do you call pangolin. In the pangolin, it's some curtains. I usually, you see, they open the curtain and showing my face to people.
It was the start of a difficult time for the young boy. He hardly had a chance to play with other children. The monks kept him apart from ordinary people. In hours of monotonous lessons, he had to learn Buddhist prayers by heart. The monks wanted to continue to influence the future of Tibet under his rule. They rarely left him alone.
Loneliness, not much, because although the surrounding people, some monk, some lay people, I always mix with them, play with them. So all these surrounding people, very, very friend, and they sort of love me. They show, I think, genuine love towards me, and also devotion.
But the young boy still had no political power. That would remain in the hands of the most senior monks and nobles until the Dalai Lama reached adulthood. For hundreds of years, Tibet had been a closed society with rules, laws, and secrets that were revealed only to the initiated. Now those secrets are known only to the elderly. While the Dalai Lama was growing up in the capital, Dorjin was a nomad child. Today, he's the elder of the Tradun caravan station. Now that he's old and poor, he's settled down. Dorjin wants to be close to a monastery, to do everything he can to make things better for him in the next life. He believes that Buddhism is stronger than communism. The wheel of time keeps turning. Nothing stays the way it is. Only in his memory is there a time when the Chinese lived on the other side of the Great Mountains, the time of the caravans.
We used to go down to the south to trade. My father used to barter yak meat, butter, salt and wool. In exchange we got hides, rice, barley and especially tea. We got just about everything a nomad needs.
Today, the nomads are no longer the traders of Tibet. It's all done by the Chinese. When smart new roads suddenly appear, it's a sure sign that the authorities and the army are not far away. They believe they're bringing progress. The Tibetans know the Chinese army are here to keep them in their place and to move in as many Chinese as possible. A big reception at the station for a new mayor in Zhongba province. The whole town has been mobilized to greet him with traditional Tibetan welcoming shawls. But he's from China. The party sent him here to oversee the development of this region. The declared goal is 10% more settlers every year. Chinese settlers, of course. They're already in a majority in the larger towns. As far as the Tibetans are concerned, he's both uninvited and unelected. But the Chinese don't care what the Tibetans think. There is no real democracy in the one-party state of the People's Republic. The immigrants don't learn Tibetan and mostly stay among themselves, according to Zhu Aifen, who owns a small supermarket in the town. She's an immigrant too. Her best customers are her fellow Chinese, mainly soldiers. They have money to spend. Tibetans could hardly afford her goods. Most of them only come in to look. Zhu Aifen plans to stay here at least 2 years before she returns home, more than 4,000 kilometers away.
Yes, of course I'm homesick. Sometimes I even cry when the feeling gets too strong. It was unbearable at first. It's a bit better now, but I still miss my family a lot.
The price that must be paid for the chance to earn far more than she could ever earn at home. The route east, towards Lhasa. Wherever you go along this route, Tibetans and Chinese have remained strangers to one another. The immigrants are still seen as occupiers. And one reason for that is the economic changes they've brought. The traditional forms of Tibetan life are now no longer possible. "60 years ago, in the small village of Sangsang, the people were poor but free. They could make a living as farmers or merchants. Today, Sangsang is a staging post for Tibetan migrant workers, entirely dependent on the Chinese. They're gathering in front of the cafe to hitch a ride back home. Inside the small cafe, Mr. and Mrs. Vasang are cooking potatoes and yak meat. They've had this restaurant for 5 years. Before, they were nomads. The business is profitable, above all because of the traveling workers. Here, hours or even days can pass without a truck coming by to take the workers home or to their next construction site. Many Tibetans are laboring on sites in East Tibet, far away from their homeland. They build houses and roads, often for the army, for a tiny wage. There's not much other work out there. These men have been traveling for 4 days. The cost of every meal they buy on the way reduces what they can take back to their wives and children, who they'll be seeing for the first time in many months.
We come from near the Great Lake over in the west. We built houses for the Chinese there. We were there for 5 months.
Many of these men are farmers who can no longer live on the income from their fields. Only a few Tibetans can still find agricultural work. For example, in these rapeseed fields, part of a special project organized with the Chinese. The Xina company, founded in 2003, bottles rapeseed and walnut oil. Almost all of it is sent to China. Now they want to export to Europe. The company has already won more than 20 prizes in China. It's what they call a progressive model business. More than half its 200 employees are former farmers or nomads, Tibetans. They're happy to have this work because they know perfectly well they could easily be replaced by machines. The man responsible for this small economic miracle is Mr. Dava. the only Tibetan businessman in the region. He's allowed to do business with 4 Chinese advisors at his side, under the stern gaze of Chairman Mao.
In my progression from being a teacher to becoming a businessman, our party and our government have given me constant support. They have given me training and education and many opportunities. They have given me strength of character and have helped me acquire knowledge. I have no one but the party to thank for the success I enjoy today.
Every word is written down by an official of the Communist Party, while Mr. Dava says exactly what they expect him to. The Chinese government sees this project as an example of successful cooperation with the Tibetans. And of course, they're the real bosses here too. It's not only Tibetans the Chinese authorities have to keep under supervision. Chinese immigrants are just as strictly controlled by the officials of the Communist Party. At first, this looks like another success story. These farmers, who come from Shanghai, tell us that once there were no melons in Tibet. But now, beneath the plastic sheets of the greenhouses, they can grow watermelons at an altitude of 4,000 meters. It's a clever idea. The watermelons are especially sweet, and they fetch a good price. Up to this point, our official Chinese minders are happy with the filming. But all that changes when we ask the leaseholders of the plantation, Mr. and Mrs. Yongding, a few questions about how their business is going and about their life in Tibet.
When there's no rain, we can manage fine without a greenhouse. But when it rains a lot, the melons soon go rotten, without the protection of the greenhouse.
And how do you like living in Tibet? It was better at home.
There's an embarrassed silence. One of our minders breaks off the interview. He's afraid that Mrs. Yongding could say something critical about Tibet. We'll never find out if she just wanted to tell us that she's homesick. The freedom to hold your own opinions is only very limited in Tibet. And if it's bad for the Chinese immigrants, it's much worse for the Tibetans. As we were about to find out in Shigatse, the country's second biggest city. In this workshop, young girls are weaving carpets. We're only allowed to film weavers who are supposedly adult. Dolma tells us that she's 21. She's been weaving carpets for tourists from China and Europe for 7 years. Even if she is now 21, she must have started working when she was 14. Child labor is strictly forbidden in China. Neither Dolma nor her friend can read or write, but they know all about piecework. If they work fast, they can earn more than $2 a day. We ask Dolma how long she works every day.
When the days are long, I work 14 hours. When the days are short, I work 12 hours.
There's a commotion behind us. One of our minders speaks.
Girl, when you give your answers, you must say you work for 10 hours in summer and for 8 hours in winter.
And Dolma answers obediently.
In summer, I work for 10 hours and in winter, 8.
The truth changes according to who's talking to you. This is a country of contradictions. A country where the authorities will manipulate children for their own purposes. They can make them disappear in this vast land, as we shall discover. On the way to Lhasa, a small diversion south to Tibet's breadbasket. Barley grows here well above the tree line, the staple grain for tsampa, the Tibetan national dish. Along the route to Lhasa, we've arranged to meet a Tibetan who's doing good business with barley. The miller's name is Tsering. That means long life in Tibetan. Now, after the barley harvest, there's a lot to do. The farmers are bringing him their grain. Tsering is 64 years old. When the Chinese came to Tibet, he was a small child. Like most Tibetans, he only knows life under the all-powerful foreigners. And he's adapted to it. That's why he's been allowed to lease the mill and buy a small plot of land. Today, the political situation is good, he tells us. If you're sensible. And he's sensible.
When my father still worked for the Tibetan lords, you couldn't earn much working in the fields. Nowadays, everything is much better.
By Tibetan standards, he's rich.
Yes, of course. I have cows, I have oxen, I have yaks, I have horses, sheep, and goats. I'm also planting an orchard.
And yet Tsering has remained a Buddhist, like almost all Tibetans, even if they've made money under the Chinese. So it's no wonder that the Chinese have also tried to regulate religion, as they did at the Tashi Lhunpo monastery in 1996. The monastery's abbot was the second most important religious leader in Tibet, the Panchen Lama. When he died, it was up to the Dalai Lama in exile to choose his successor. He named a 6-year-old boy as the reincarnation of the Panchen Lama. But the Chinese didn't like his choice, and together with cooperative monks, they made their own selection. When Tibetan protests failed to die down, the Chinese simply made both children disappear.
The one, I choose Panchen Lama, no information where he is. And according to Chinese officials, he gets normal education. They said that. I hope should be true.
There's been no sign of life from him for 12 years. The youngest political prisoner in the world must now be an adult. For the monks in Tashi Lhunpo monastery, he is the real Panchen Lama and their abbot. They reject, as spiritual leader, the boy chosen by the Chinese. We aren't allowed to ask the monks about that. Instead, our minders encourage us to film this old-style logical debate, the kind they like to show the tourists.
Not only the monk of the traditional monastery is sort of concerned, but also I think whole Tibetan, the Panchen Lama, important Lama in Tibetan history or Tibetan Buddhist sort of community. So therefore, it is really sad.
It's difficult to believe that the real Panchen Lama will ever live in his own monastery. The Chinese are holding him incommunicado and will give no information about his whereabouts. The other boy, the one they chose, appears now and again at official events. He probably lives in Beijing, shut off from the outside world. The Chinese have never brought him to Tashi Lhunpo. They're afraid of the monks' protests. The monks are left with nothing but the shrine of the late 10th Panchen Lama. The boy in this picture means nothing to them. The children in this classroom will never learn anything about the two Panchen Lamas. After years of neglect, the Chinese are beginning to send Tibetan children to school again. Religion is not taught here, but history is. And there's even one Tibetan hero, albeit from the Middle Ages. Who was Tang Tong Gebu? What was the special thing he did? He built iron bridges and wooden bridges. Teaching is alternately in Tibetan and Chinese. The children learn English too. The Chinese need better educated Tibetans to fuel the booming economy. So today there are schools in most of the bigger towns. That's something new. Mr. Shersang, the teacher, is Tibetan. He's also an official in the Chinese Communist Party.
Even though some children live a long way away from school, education is guaranteed for every child in this country. The government has issued very clear instructions. All children must go to school, whether they live nearby or far away.
Unfortunately, that's not true. On our long journey through Tibet, we met many children and young people who have never been to school. The Chinese still tend to get the better jobs and a better education. But the Tibetans know that they must come to terms with the Chinese and their officials because they are running their country. For example, the traditional harvest festival has been adapted for the new times. Pictures of Chairman Mao and Deng Xiaoping have become part of traditional folklore. Young and old together celebrate the fact that barley has grown again at an altitude of 4,000 meters, that there was enough sun, and that the people will have enough to eat for another year. For most of these people, that's much more important than high politics. And thanks to Chinese censorship, they hear very little of unrest elsewhere. They don't really care if Communist Party officials are sitting on the podium, and that one of them is their children's teacher, Mr. Shersang. And they know that under Chinese rule, some of them will succeed. The people used to depend on traditional healers. Today, modern medical care has reached even the most isolated areas. This doctor is called Tondol Lamo. It means goddess who saves you when you catch sight of her. For her patients, she really does sometimes seem to work miracles. She studied for 8 years, first Western medicine in China, and then traditional Tibetan healing arts in her homeland.
Are most of the pains up here? Yes. My shoulder. And my knee. In both places, then? And your stomach? Does that hurt? No, not today. Don't get cold. Don't get cold. You have to look after yourself better. Yes, yes. If you get cold, that'll make you ill too.
The patient has a degenerative disease of the joints. The result of a hard life, whose high point was a pilgrimage to Kailash, a long, long time ago. Mrs. Cherdzom was already a shepherd when the Chinese marched into her country 60 years ago. She's been poor her whole life. She hopes things will be better for her in the next life. Otherwise, why did she do the pilgrimage around Mount Kailash? But the doctor believes that too much religion can be harmful, at least from a medical point of view.
The most common illnesses of my patients are headaches, altitude sickness, and painful joints, because they walk around so many sacred sites. They keep walking in a circle, and their feet hurt.
It's a topsy-turvy world. Religion is a sensitive subject, the Tibetan doctor says. Religion can be useful, the Chinese answer, especially if you can make money with it. At first sight, Sakya Monastery hardly seems to be a sacred place at all. The Chinese almost completely destroyed Sakya half a century ago. Today, they're rebuilding the monastery. On this great building site, Tibetan craftsmen are breaking the stone by hand, as they've done for centuries. The Chinese need the monastery for the tourists.
I earn $3.50 a day.
And how many hours do you work?
From dawn to the evening, till sunset.
Devout Tibetans don't ask if that's a fair wage. In their floor dance, they stamp down the clay beneath their feet, and they're happy if they can help with the rebuilding of the monastery. And the Chinese aren't interested in making up for the violence and cruelty of the past. They want to attract thousands of visitors to the area. So they need an intact monastery, and they need monks who belong there. The monks at Sakya don't really care what the Chinese think, as long as they can practice their Buddhist beliefs and their dance meditation in peace. There's no guarantee of that in today's Tibet, where monks are not allowed to preach in public outside the monastery, and religion in general is a touchy subject. For instance, religious people are banned from working for the state, because like almost all Tibetans, they have a prayer shrine at home.
The renovation is making the monastery beautiful again. Anyone who studies here will be spiritually healthy.
How many monks are there in the monastery now?
The Chinese only allowed 120 to be here, but in fact, there are now nearly 200. But not all of them live here.
How many monks used to live here?
At least 500, but usually more than 1,000.
Everything is written down. Who knows who for? We were probably only allowed to film in Sakya because the monks belong to a branch of Buddhism that is not led by the Dalai Lama. For hundreds of years, this monastery opposed the Dalai Lama in the power game of old Tibet. But since there hasn't been any power to fight over for so long, the two schools of Buddhism are no longer in dispute. They have one common goal: cultural autonomy for Tibet. Sakya shared the fate of almost all Tibet's monasteries since the Chinese invasion. Religion was to be destroyed. It's something the Tibetans will never forgive. Since Toling, we have covered 2,000 kilometers and crossed 5 government checkpoints. Tibet's legendary capital of Lhasa is near. For a moment, we hope to find something we recognize, something we've read about in Tibet's history. But apart from the Potala, the former palace of the Dalai Lama, nothing is the way it used to be. The Potala looms over the valley like a giant fortress, with its 1,000 rooms, built of clay, wood and stone, without the use of a single nail. Traditionally, foreigners were only allowed to enter the Potala with special permission. Today, more than 3,000 Chinese tourists come here every day, with the railway alone. There are long waiting lists for the railway tickets. For the Chinese, Tibet is a giant theme park, 4,000 meters up in the mountains, with one star attraction: the Potala. Entry tickets for the Potala are always sold out long in advance, even though the Chinese are almost forced to be atheists by their national ideology. It's impossible to say if any of these visitors are devout Buddhists. Nobody would dare to murmur religious formulas or pray in front of the ever-present police. And you won't find a single picture of the Dalai Lama, who lived here before he went into exile. The city at the foot of the Potala has long been a Chinese city. 300,000 Chinese and only 60,000 Tibetans. That's what the experts estimate. There are no official figures. The Chinese have built their entertainment centers close to the Tibetans' holy places. The Babado Club is one of them. You won't find any Tibetans here. In the private rooms in the karaoke bar, you meet young, rich Chinese who've made it in Tibet.
Some of us run factories here. Some of us deal in building materials.
Why are you doing business in Tibet?
Tibet is one of the regions in the state strategy for the opening up of Western China. We can do very good business with raw materials here.
And the Chinese couldn't care less that most Tibetans regard them as foreign occupiers.
Everyone in the world likes Tibet. Tibet is an inseparable part of China. So as a Chinese person, I like Tibet even more.
That's the best. Tibet is best. We love Tibet. Yeah.
The young Chinese who meet in the disco under the karaoke bar have known nothing but the truth of their communist leaders. And according to them, Tibet has been part of China since the 13th century. These young people have never heard that before the Chinese invasion, Tibet was an independent state, and that Tibet's status is still disputed on the international stage. The devout Tibetans in the center of Lhasa almost seem like foreign bodies in this modern Chinese city. They hope for a say in their future and for an end to the Chinese immigration policy. The Chinese can't understand why after 60 years of communist re-education, Buddhism is stronger than ever before, and why even today the Dalai Lama is revered by Tibetans as a god. It's their religion that's keeping this nation alive.
Almost 60 years. The opposition of religion is sort of official sort of stand. And Chinese sort of also the cruelty, cruel attitude you see, towards Tibetan culture, Tibetan Buddhism, in reality counterproductive. Tibetan side more sort of also the determined because of now external threat to their century-old cultural value. So they stand more firmer.
Tibetans still come from all over the country to the sacred Yokhang temple in the city center. Here they can be among their own, walking round the temple's pilgrim path with their prayer wheels, tolerated by the Chinese.
We practice the Buddhist religion in order to bring well-being to the whole world, so that there will be no wars, so there will be no conflict, so all beings will live in peace. Those are my prayers.
Perhaps she also prays that the Dalai Lama can one day return to a country that 60 years ago belonged to the Tibetans alone. When the Chinese invaded, the monks lost their power and the Tibetans their independence. At first there were negotiations. Then the Dalai Lama was to be arrested. The young ruler was in despair. He wanted to remain with his people, but his advisors feared for his life. There was only one solution. Consult the state oracle. In a deep trance, a monk must dance to the decision. 2 balls of dough in the bowl have small pieces of paper inside them. One says yes to flee, the other says no to stay. The decision is in the hands of the gods. Lawless, yes, the Dalai Lama must flee. And so in March 1959, the Dalai Lama crossed the border into India, where he still remains in exile. For many Tibetans, the news of his departure seemed like the end of the world. In 60 years, their leader has not been permitted to visit them, even though he is the one person who could bring about the peaceful coexistence of all the peoples in Tibet. But for the Chinese, nothing could be worse than the return of the God King to his own country. Even if the Chinese say they're prepared to talk, they still exclude the Dalai Lama from all decisions affecting Tibet and its people. So Tibetans continue to quit their country to join him in exile. The escape route is hazardous, with Chinese border patrols that shoot to kill. Many children are sent here by their parents. Many die on the way. And yet their spiritual leader still believes in peaceful change in Tibet.
If chaotic situation develop, then there is nobody's interest. So smooth transition is very, very essential. Other top leaderships are, I think, is following that way. So therefore, within 5 years, 10 years, I think China becoming more open society, more and more open. I think comparatively more freedoms should come. So that's my view.